Dawn of the Dukes is the dawn of a new Arabia. Arabia is by far the most commonly played map, and the changes to it have proven to be quite controversial. So in this video, we're going to open up the map scripts of both the new and old Arabias and look into the nuts and bolts of how they're implemented, and we'll have lots of fun math along the way. What exactly is a random map script? It's a text file consisting of a set of commands that instruct the game on how to generate each map. These commands control the layouts of terrains, the placements of player bases and starting units, the generations of forests and cliffs, and pretty much everything else related to how the map appears at the start of each game. If we want to look at these files ourselves, we can right-click AoE2DE in Steam and go to Manage, Browse Local Files. Then we navigate to Resources, Common, DRS. Here, Game Data X1 contains the files that were used in the HD edition, and Game Data X2 contains the files that are used currently in the Definitive Edition. And if you have the original game, the map files are stored in Game Data X1.drs, and we can use TurtlePack to extract the Arabia map and corresponding files. We can open up map scripts using any text editor. I'm personally using Visual Studio Code at the moment, but you could even use the horrors of Notepad if you want something extremely simple. I encourage you to open up Arabia yourself if you want to sing along at home. Let's take a tour of the Arabia script from AoC and the script currently in DE and highlight their differences. The original game has a 50-50 chance of generating a desert version of Arabia or a grass version of Arabia. DE does the same thing, but uses a larger assortment of biomes. In the land generation section, the maps use a base terrain, which is the background terrain for the map. The original map uses dirt if it's a desert map, or grass 3 otherwise. The Definitive Edition always uses desert as its background terrain for all of its biomes. Unlike the original, this desert does not appear in the final map generation. The terrain is just a placeholder, and later on in the map script, we will cover up this desert with other terrains. Now that the background is set, the map scripts create the player lands. These are the locations where the player bases are created, with the player's town center being placed at the center of the lands. These lands use the same terrain as the map's base terrain, so the exact shape and size of each land doesn't matter too much for these Arabia scripts. The centers of the lands are just where the player TCs are placed. Next, DE uses the circle radius command. As I explained in an earlier video, this command forces the player lands to spawn roughly in a circle. The patch notes, oh yes, the patch notes, state that slight variance has been added to the player TC locations, and that's true from a certain point of view. If we look at 100 generations of the new Arabia map and add this data to our old plot with the TC locations from AoC and the old DE map, we see this is correct. The TC locations still are more restricted than they were in the original map, but their locations do have a bit more variation than they did in DE's previous version. But these patch notes only explain what happens for 1v1s. For 4v4s, well, the patch notes must be written from the point of view that the Jedi are evil. The circle radius instructions had been commented out for larger map sizes, but now they're used. If we look at map generations for 4v4s, then we see that the town centers spawn perfectly on the circle every time without any variation. In the original game, there were basically 4 rectangles along the sides of the map where the TCs could be located, but for now, DE has done away with the system. And finally, DE has one more create land command, which creates a land in the middle of the map. This land uses the dirt terrain, which replaces some of the desert being used as the map's base terrain. The land has a border, which is the distance from the top, right, bottom, and left sides of the map that the land avoids. The land percent is set to 100, so this dirt land fills as much of the map as possible, being restricted only by these boundaries and by the existing player lands. The little corners we see occasionally cut out from the dirt land are the player lands where the TCs later will be placed. The circle radius keeps these lands just on the outside of the dirt. Moving on, the patch notes state that hills now can appear closer to player town centers. So is this true? Well, let's check out the elevation generation section of the map scripts to find out. Elevation generation is responsible for placing hills on the map. The original game creates elevation of height 7 distributed throughout the entire map, except for avoiding the immediate areas around the centers of player lands. There is a hard-coded distance of about 9 tiles where elevation is not allowed to be generated near the player TCs. Also note that elevations are 0 indexed in the map scripts, but 1 indexed in the scenario editor. What we create as elevation 1 in a map script ends up being called elevation 2 when we generate a map in the editor. The number of tiles controls how many tiles of the map are placed at a higher elevation. This instruction counts not only the tops of the elevations, but also the slopes on the sides of the hills. And the number of clumps controls how this elevation is split up into separate hills. For example, we can set 6,000 tiles at elevation 7. This elevation is split into 20 separate clumps, so that's a total of 6,000 tiles separated into 20 hills. Note that sometimes hills are placed adjacent to each other and blend together, thus we won't always see exactly 20 distinct hills if we stop and count them. The numbers of tiles and clumps correspond to a 100 by 100 map. But no map actually is that small, with a tiny map being 120 by 120. Instead, the numbers are scaled for larger maps. The set scale by size instruction increases the number of tiles, and the set scale by groups instruction increases the number of clumps. But here we run into a couple of issues. First, we see that the classic Arabia uses both set scale by size and set scale by groups. However, if both of these instructions are used, then only the final one is accounted for in the map script. Thus, only set scale by size is used. But wait, there was another bug. Back in AoC, the behaviors of the two elevation scaling commands were swapped. For larger team games, the number of elevation tiles always is 6,000, but the number of clumps increases since set scale by size is listed last, but has the wrong behavior. We see this if we generate maps of different sizes. They both have roughly 6,000 tiles at elevation 7, but the 8-player map has more separate hills than does the 2-player map. In the definitive edition, the behavior of set scale by size and set scale by groups was swapped back, so now it's correct. But that means whenever we port a script from the original game to DE, we need to take care of these commands as well. To replicate exactly the behavior of the original Arabia, we use only set scale by groups. Now, there's one more quirk about elevation. The hills are not distributed evenly about the map. Rather, there is a bias that they spawn mostly in the south. For everyone who's played the AoC version of Arabia, we've all seen those crater bases we sometimes get in the south, with huge hills surrounding us. DE does have an option to enable balanced elevation, which distributes the hills more evenly. To demonstrate how this works, let's create two nearly identical Arabia map scripts, with the only difference being that one of them uses enable balanced elevation. Now we'll average together the height at each tile over all 100 maps, and we see there is indeed a bias for more elevation to be created in the south for the original AoC Arabia script. So that's just about everything to know about the create elevation command. Let's now move on and see how DE uses it. The new Arabia actually has two separate create elevation commands. What are the key differences here? First, DE uses elevation 5 instead of elevation 7, that way the hills aren't as high. Second, it splits the hill generation up into two parts, the dirt terrain in the middle and the desert terrain on the outside. Third, it uses significantly fewer tiles, so there is less elevation at the maximum height than there was in the past. For 1v1, this change amounts to using 2,000 total tiles in two groups of 15. And in order to scale both by size and by groups, there is a sequence of if statements that explicitly sets the numbers of tiles and clumps for each map size. And finally, DE uses enable balanced elevation, as we might expect. Let's repeat the same experiment from before. We'll generate 100 copies of DE's current Arabia script, and compare the average elevation at each tile to the data we gathered for AoC Arabia. The first thing we note is that using elevation 5 instead of elevation 7 indeed makes the average heights much smaller. But what's that mound doing in the middle of DE's map? Well, the elevation commands are split up to have 50% of their tiles on the dirt and 50% on the desert, but the dirt terrain consists of only about 30% of the map's tiles. That means 30% of the map gets 50% of the hills. There's also a distinct valley surrounding that middle hill. The elevation spawns only on its base terrain and does not cross from one terrain to the other. This has the effect of creating a ring of elevation 0 in the center of the map that never has hills on it. So, now, what about those patch notes? can the hills spawn closer to player town centers? Well, compared to the original Arabia, the answer is no. For our 100 maps, we can take the minimum Euclidean distance between each TC and the closest tile with elevation strictly greater than 0. Each map script has at least one generation where a hill spawns at the hard-coded minimum of 9 tiles from the TC, and the average minimum distance is similar between AoC and DE as well. Hence, compared to the AoC script, the distance between TCs and hills is pretty much unchanged. But there's one more map script we have to look at, and that's the previous version of Arabia that DE used. If we also generate 100 versions of this map and look at these statistics, then we see that the hills are indeed further away from the TCs. But if the hard-coded minimum distance is 9 tiles, then why are these hills further away? This has to do with the terrains used for the player lands. Whereas AoC and the current DE maps use the same terrain for the player lands as they do for the overall base terrain, the old DE map used water for the player lands. The old map places hills on the map's base terrain, therefore they avoid the water terrain of the player lands. This usage of different terrains then creates an avoidance area around the town centers where the elevation isn't able to spawn. Let's look again at the average elevations of the map tiles and compare the old and new DE Arabias. For the old Arabia, we see that the elevation is highest in the center and edges of the map. This happens due to the usage of the circle radius command. The player lands fall on a circle indicated by the valley in the plot. The hills avoid these lands, leading to this circle having the lower average heights. So at the end of the day, the new map script in DE allows for hills to be closer to the player bases, but it uses the same values as does the old Arabia from AoC. And overall, there's significantly less elevation on the map than there used to be, both in number of elevated tiles and in the overall heights of the hills. For completeness, the HD edition uses essentially the same Arabia map script from AoC, but there are a couple of minor changes. Among them is the reduction of the number of tiles for elevation for 1v1s from 6,000 tiles to 3,000 tiles. I've never actually heard anyone discuss this change before, so I wonder if it's something people noticed or accounted for in their gameplay. We did carry this change over to Wooloo Kingdoms, so that change in elevation did affect the competitive scene for quite a while. Now that the elevation is generated, it's time to look at the cliffs. This section is pretty simple. The original Arabia has cliffs, DE originally reduced the number of cliffs, and now DE has removed all of the cliffs. Personally, I do think that cliffs can be annoying, and I rather liked the earlier change to reduce them, but I also think that removing them completely is a step too far. The behavior of the earlier version of DE is the one that I prefer. Next up is the Terrain Generation section. First, we'll look at how the AoC Arabia map generates forests. These forests are not placed specifically for any players, but instead are distributed randomly throughout the map. The forests are spaced 5 tiles away from any cliffs and have a distance of about 13 tiles where they're not allowed to spawn near player town centers. The forests take up 12% of the map, which for a standard 1v1 consists of approximately 1,728 trees. The set scale by groups instruction works correctly for terrain generation, so the number of clumps is scaled by the map size. And like the elevation clumps, multiple forests may be placed adjacent to each other and combine to form one larger forest. Next, there is a bit of dirt or grass placed throughout the map to break up the monotony of the terrain. Then another set of forests is placed, this time using 3 clumps to fill 1% of the map, which comes out to 144 trees in a tiny 1v1 map. Afterwards, there are a couple more patches of terrain added to make the map look pretty. And finally, for the desert maps, there are small ponds added on top of the primary forest trees. That means the desert version of the map actually has fewer trees than the grass version, with the oases consuming about 144 tiles of trees. Many players found those ponds to be quite annoying, so there's a common map called Dry Arabia that simply removes these ponds from the map script. And in the Definitive Edition's map script, there are significant changes made to the way these woodlines are generated. DE's map creates a region of grass terrain surrounding the desert terrain that makes up the player lands. This grass is placed on the desert, so it avoids the dirt in the middle. And it's given a radius to avoid player start areas, creating pockets of desert where the player bases are located. This command is repeated 3 times, just to ensure that the entire outside of the map is covered by grass. Sometimes, if a create terrain command is used only once, it doesn't actually cover 100% of the area it's supposed to cover, and repeating the command usually solves the issue and covers the remaining terrain. Next, more create terrain commands cover the dirt in the middle of the map with grass, and now the entire map is covered with grass except for the deserts used for the player bases. The deserts end up roughly as crescents rather than full circles, since the center land already has kept the desert away from the middle. Next, there is a command to place one clump of rock onto desert terrain. This focuses one of the player lands and replaces it entirely with the rock terrain. The next few create terrain commands use a base layer of rock. This hack lets the map script place terrains on each individual land one at a time. The next command makes one patch of forest consisting of exactly 67 trees on the rock terrain. The Woody's constant is determined by the biome that was selected randomly at the start of the map script. The forest terrain is placed on the rock terrain, and it has a minimum distance away from the player's start area where it's allowed to spawn. This is what pushes the forest towards the edges of the map. The restriction that it must be on this terrain, and that the crescent shape of the terrain, means that the center and front of the rock is so close to the player's start location that the forest only can spawn at the back or at the edges. Next, a 67 tile terrain of grass 2 is placed on the rock, and this grass terrain is replaced with the forest terrain. This trick keeps the second forest away from the first, so there are always distinct patches that don't merge together. The spacing to other terrain types instruction only works on terrains that are different. It keeps grass 2 away from the forest, but it doesn't keep one forest away from another forest. This technique is then used again in order to create the third forest. Now, all three of the player's forests are placed, and finally, the rock terrain is covered up with dirt 3. Covering the rock terrain with dirt allows us to start the process all over again. One of the desert terrains is replaced with rock, and the same sequence of commands is used. This previous section of code is repeated 7 more times in order to generate the forests for the maximum of 8 players. Although, to be safe, I'd recommend repeating this code more than just 8 times. For a 4v4, if any one of these generations fails, then there will be a player who doesn't have a proper base. I suspect that repeating this code several more times would eliminate bugs such as these, or at least reduce the chances of them occurring. Next, the map is themed. When we picked the biome at the start of the script, we defined a terrain as Layer A, which is the terrain used as the background of the map. The next few commands repeatedly replace all of the grass and dirt on the map with this terrain, covering it completely. After that, we add the rest of the forests to the map using 2 create terrain commands. They're also given quite generous distances to avoid the player's start areas, so they'll never be closer to the players than the forests that are generated specifically for them. The terrain generation section ends by adding in a few more patches to break up the monotony of the map's background terrain. DE's previous version of Arabia used a similar technique to generate 3 forests for each player, but it didn't have the dirt land in the middle, so the trees were not prohibited from spawning at the front. If we look at a few maps, it becomes pretty easy to pick up on which forests are a neutral part of the map and which forests belong to the player. The avoidance distances are large enough that the forests often cannot spawn in the middle of the map and are forced away to the edges. Here's a comparison between the various versions of Arabia. We can see how in the current version, the middle of the map is a barren desert, devoid of vegetation and filled only with the dry hills of the dirt terrain. And immediately around player bases, there's much less wood than there has been in the past. We can graph the average number of trees that are within a given distance from the player town center. There are a couple of spikes near the beginning of the graph, so let's zoom in on them. Here we see the placement of 3 forests on the player lands. Then there's a sharp horizontal flat representing the distance between the player trees and the other trees that are randomly distributed throughout the map. The rather straight slope of the original AoC represents the random distribution of the trees. There's a small avoidance distance at the start, and then they're distributed rather evenly. Now we get to the final section of the map script, Objects Generation. The original Arabia imports a land resources file. This file is shared by most of the maps from the original game. It gives the placement of objects we're all familiar with. Each player receives 8 sheep, 2 boars, 6 berries, 3 groups of gold mines, and 2 groups of stone mines, and there are extra resources distributed throughout the map. For 1v1s in particular, there are 2 groups of 3 tiles of gold and 1 group of either 3 or 4 tiles of stone. I think the core takeaway from this script is that Arabia uses almost exactly the standard resources shared by most maps. There is nothing unique or special about the script's object generation. It's just about as standard as it possibly can get. DE also splits its object generation off to a separate file called Generating Objects. The Arabia map script defines various labels, and then the Generating Objects file controls the placement of objects based on which labels are defined. This file is much more complex than is the original land resources file, coming in at almost 7,500 lines of code. Recall that the objects that are spawned for each player now always spawn at the same distance for all players, whereas in the original map, one player could have close sheep while the other had far sheep. I had made a video about these distances in the past, so let's compare how DE places its sheep now. It turns out that the longest distance the sheep are allowed to be from the TC has been reduced. There's nothing special about this change. A few lines of code were just commented out, and the random blocks probabilities were adjusted accordingly. The 2 groups of extra sheep still use the same distance for both groups. That hasn't been changed. Wild boar also haven't moved closer to player TCs in DE when compared to AoC Arabia, and combined with the change that boars follow villagers after being shot only once, it's far less dangerous to send hunters after the pigs. We no longer have those situations where a boar is over a hill on the far end of a diagonal behind a woodline. They are now much simpler for players to bring in. But perhaps the most curious change to the object generation has to do with the placement of the player's 3rd gold mine. These mines are now much further away from players than they used to be, and using min distance to players keeps the resources away not only from players, but also from the centers of neutral lands. By adding the center dirt land to the map script, the extra golds are forced away from the middle as well. I don't know if this is intentional, but it does keep the golds towards the sides away from the players. And one more big difference concerns relic generation. In the past, the 5 relics were spread out across the map. Now each player is given their own relic. This relic is placed near each player's base, the same way their gold mine and other resources are placed. It will also avoid the middle of the map. In 1v1s, the remaining 3 relics are still spread out randomly throughout the map, but in 4v4s, there are no neutral relics. Here the number of relics has been increased from 5 to 8, and every player has their own. That means if a team coordinates, then they can give all 4 of their relics to a Lithuanian player pretty much every game, without even needing to fight over relics in neutral territory. And finally, there's a weird bug with Empire Wars. Every villager that is created underneath the TC at the start is male, unlike the rest of the villagers, who each have a 50-50 chance of being male or female. To understand why this occurs, well, getting the villagers underneath the TC in the first place is rather complicated. Flags are placed under the TC. These flags are given 0 HP so they die immediately. When the flags die, they become villagers, and these villagers are not randomized when they're used as a dead object like they are when they're placed just as standard objects on the map. And that wraps up our tour of the map scripts. The original Arabia did have a couple of bugs caused by the map generation engine that went unnoticed, but in my opinion, the new script for DE goes way too far in attempting to make changes to the map. DE's current script might not be quite as bad as the version that had resources spawning in crosses, but it still has some glaring issues. I'd argue that the main reason the classic Dry Arabia is so popular is because it's just about the most standard map we can create. In my opinion, the biggest problem with the new version of Arabia is that it takes a map with no gimmicks, then adds a gimmick to it. It's possible to do some very amazing things, even with the existing limitations of the scripting language, but amazing shouldn't be necessary to achieve simplicity. When we include the code of the files the current Arabia map imports, we end up with a script that's over 10 times the length of the original one, ballooning from about 800 lines of code to over 9,000. Something with that much complexity takes a great deal of testing and understanding in order to get working correctly. There have been some pretty obvious bugs pointed out in the current map script, and it doesn't feel like it's gone through the proper process of iteration that's necessary to prepare it for release into the actual game. particularly when it's used to fix something that isn't broken. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Arabia. That's it for now. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.